Hello?
Hi. This was the third year that Ethan attended the track camp at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And in those 2 years, we've always made it a point to try to make the most of being in Colorado, knowing it's a 12-hour drive back to Dallas. The first 2 years, we hit Great Sand Dunes National Park. The first year was a bust. That's actually Ethan way back there, most likely miserable because I didn't know we needed wax for the board. But last year was redemption. We found wax and dune surfing was a success. But this year we thought we would try something different. After all, while it might sound fun, and it is, to hike the dunes, they're at 8,000 feet in elevation. It's exhausting, especially for a kid who a week prior got hit by a car, competed at nationals the next day, and then spent a week at track camp. Not so much. I grew up in Washington State, and as a kid, we'd go camping all the time. We lived on an island, so we would go fishing all the time too. Camping and fishing are kind of those archetypal father-son bonding experiences. But when you live in a place like Dallas, Texas, it's not that easy. I mean, you can, but it means hours in the car, most likely to New Mexico or Colorado, which is fine. But I'm not sleeping in a tent when the nighttime temperature is 90 degrees. And that's Texas, like 8 months out of the year. Nope. Ethan is 16. He'll be 17 this year. A junior. That was actually yesterday. So my opportunities to do something like this are few and far between with the time that we still have, just because of life. I've only been able to take Ethan camping and fishing once, 11 years ago, November 2012. He just turned 6, and we went to Lake of the Arbuckles in Oklahoma. Normally, I'm pretty good at planning things like this, and I knew it wasn't supposed to rain. I just didn't think it would have gotten that cold. You know, I'm ready to blow his 6-year-old mind with catching fish and cleaning fish and teaching him how to build a campfire and cooking fish over a campfire and sleeping in a tent, all that shit. We get there and our site is right on the lake. We tried fishing, didn't get a nibble. Okay, try again tomorrow. So go chop some wood, build a fire, play with a hatchet, do outdoor shit that 6-year-olds want to do. But Murphy's Law. Ethan woke up in the middle of the night freezing his ass off, and in the morning we crawled out of our tent to discover that it was cold. It was in the teens, I remember. And all of our food and all of our water had completely frozen over. All of our shit was frozen, and he's never liked the cold. So all these years, I've wanted to redeem myself. Now we finally have the opportunity, and we're doing it. Monument Lake, Colorado, an hour west of Trinidad. Let's go to Colorado. Got everything packed up, loaded up, gassed up. I had to pick Ethan up in Colorado Springs by noon the next day. But it's a 12-hour drive, and I had zero desire to drive through the night. So I found a cheap bed in Amarillo and decided to split the drive in half. The drive from Dallas to the New Mexico border is awful. It just blows. And I've done it so many times that I've almost got it memorized. What little no stop sign town comes next? Every place the speed limit drops from 75 to 30, and every seemingly abandoned town that I've always just driven straight through. I've seen this old boarded up highway motel a dozen times with this old red busted down Ford crapped out in the parking lot. And as I see it, I just drive by. This trip, I saw it and I drove by until I got about a mile down the road, and then I decided to turn around. Places like this litter rural parts of Texas, as they probably do everywhere else. But the thought that's never lost on me is that at one point, people stayed in this motel and people worked these little businesses and lived in these little towns. I've always wondered about who those people were, where they went, why they left. Who was the last person to ever rent a room here? Who never came back for their truck? Because Texas is so massive, from Dallas halfway to Colorado Springs means you are still in Texas and you still have to go through New Mexico. So I had to get my ass up before the sun to make sure I made it there by noon. Just across the border into New Mexico is a rest stop that I always stop at. It's actually right before the scenery on the drive starts to improve. As I parked, I noticed that there was an older gentleman down towards the end of the lot that had his 2 horses out of their trailer. I am not a street photographer. I rarely approach strangers about wanting to take their portrait. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I've done it a handful of times, and it's hard for me to be inconspicuous taking a photograph of someone without their knowledge when I'm holding this. So I waffled on whether to approach him, and I ended up kind of casually sauntering over and saying hello. We ended up bullshitting about the hailstorm he had just driven through, and even though it was about 8 a.m., he looked like he could use a drink. I was going to ask to take his portrait, but I don't think his horses cared for me too much. Once I got Ethan, hard part's over. Just 3.5 more hours in the car. At least the views were better. Once Ethan said he was up for fishing and camping, I was stoked. I hadn't had the opportunity to do this with him in 11 years, and I was intent on not having another repeat camping disappointment. There are so many gorgeous places to camp or fish or both in Colorado, but not wanting to add an extra 6 hours to the drive that's already 12 hours to get home. The farther south, the better. So found this place called Monument Lake. And the photos looked gorgeous. It's at 9,000 feet in elevation. So the temperature at the end of June is going to be perfect. And I'm thinking, fuck yeah. Find a spot on the north end of the lake that looks like it's as close to the water as possible. Site 42. And it says primitive RV and tent. That's it. So I think, big deal. I don't have an RV, so there's no hookup. Bummer. That's not what that means. When they say primitive, they're not fucking around. It might as well have been sloped concrete with sharp rock sprinkles. No grass, no dirt, just this shit. Thankfully, we each had sleeping pads, but still, it felt like you think that you can lay a paper towel over Legos on the floor and walk over it barefoot and not feel shit. So, open a beer and make the best of it. I could have just picked him up and drove straight back to Texas and said, we'll go camping later. Later was 11 years ago. I'm sure so many of us have memories from our childhoods of what felt like our parents forcing us on some boring ass road trip to the Grand Canyon or some family vacation that we had zero desire to participate in. We had friends and a social life, a girlfriend or a boyfriend. We had better shit to be doing. And I try to be cognizant of that for my son. There is a fine line between pushing them too far to the point that they're never going to want to do it with you again, whatever that is, and just trying to get them to have fun. But when you're 16, for most kids, being stuck camping with your dad, away from your friends, away from your girlfriend, and cell service. But for me, him growing up, it has been a constant exercise in learning how to let go. And even though I know that, I'm still trying to steal time because I know that when we get back to Dallas, life will pick back up. School's going to start. He'll spend more time with his friends or at work, all of which means less time. So to symbolically hold him hostage in the woods is me trying to fight back against the one thing that only ever takes. It never gives. And I only have so much time left to take. We tell ourselves that we've still got time to do this and time to do that and go here and go see that. And we don't. I just want to help him see and do as much as he can for us, even if he thinks it's boring. Sorry, buddy. Once we got everything set up and settled down, I could tell that he was less than thrilled at the realization that he would be doing this for 2 days. So I made him a proposition. I said, we're here. I had to buy our fishing licenses. We've got a cooler full of ice. If we wake up early and catch our limit, we can leave early. And after he gave a long enough pause as to not hurt my feelings, deal. So we call it a night, a very short-lived night. I hadn't even fallen asleep yet before I started to hear this howling wind through the pine trees. If you've ever heard wind in pine trees, it almost hisses. And as it continues to grow stronger, I'm laying on my back, staring straight up, listening for deadfall cracks, just as my tent starts to tremble nonstop. All night, it sounds like somebody sanding lumber next to my ear. It was calm when I positioned my tent, not knowing that I basically turned it into a wind tunnel and I was getting sandblasted by the dirt blowing in through the vent at my head. All night, nonstop. I had my alarm set for 6 a.m. to get up early and try fishing, but when I looked at my phone, it was maybe 5 a.m. and I hadn't slept, so I just got up. I let Ethan sleep, grabbed my gear, and walked down to the lake. It was just me and one other guy about 50 yards to my right. We had the whole lake to ourselves. I cast out and I watched my bobber just sit there. I look to my right and I see the other guy cast out and he's not using a bobber. Now, I did my research and everything I read said that the best chance of catching a trout in a lake in Colorado was a bobber. The guy next to me caught 3 and I didn't even get a goddamn nibble. A little more time passes and this kid just appears out of the bushes about 10 feet to my left. This lake is a mile long and a quarter mile wide, and this kid stands right next to me and starts frantically casting out and reeling in because he's seeing fish jump everywhere. He sees a fish jump on my right, and he casts over my line. And as he's reeling in, we tangle. And I'm trying not to get frustrated with it or him, so I end up just cutting my line. And as I'm starting to retie all of my tackle, his ass casts back out. His dad walks down. Kid catches a fish. I just packed up my shit and walked back up. I know I could have waited and walked down there with Ethan, but I know it would have been boring as hell for him because we didn't stand a chance catching a fish. It's hard not to come away from things like this and not immediately think, failure. I wanted to do this. He'd have been just fine driving straight back. This wasn't his idea. Did I want to redeem myself from 11 years ago? Absolutely. But I also wanted to preserve my time with him when I can't do this with him anymore. I've got photos of me camping and fishing with my dad and my grandpa when I was a kid, and I treasure those memories. I want him to be able to say, yeah, my dad took me camping, but I don't feel like I'm doing a good enough job. Walked back up and started cooking breakfast, beer and hot dogs. For me anyway. I knew fishing was going to be a bust. After all, you can't really see your bobber when it's windy, and it was getting windy. And I know fishing just isn't Ethan's thing, and that's okay. Once he crawled out of his tent, you just kind of got the notion that he had already had his fill. So I released him from his contractual obligation, and we headed out.
It was so cold.
You were cold?
I was cold, and then I got back into here, and now I'm really hot. Ow.
However, I had just loaded a roll of film because I had hoped to take a picture of Ethan catching his first trout. But I knew that there were two places we were going to stop on the way home regardless. I've done this drive so many times that I find myself taking photographs of the exact same things each drive. Nothing about them ever changes. But it's almost compulsory for me to stop and shoot them, if for nothing else, to see if my perspective has changed. Just on the border of New Mexico and Texas, outside the small town of Clayton, New Mexico, is this, I don't know what you call it, honestly. It's just a white building with a red roof on a cattle ranch. But every time I pass it, I take the same photograph. Sometimes I like it. Sometimes it's just a photo. Five hours down the road is a small town of Chillicothe, Texas, population 554. I don't know whatever possessed me to stop here in the first place years ago, but it, like that cattle building back in New Mexico, has this weird draw to it. Specifically, this very old abandoned building right on the highway, and in it, dozens of old stadium chairs. And a wood door. That's it. That's what I feel compelled to photograph every time. Every time I find myself passing through, I'm compelled to stop and photograph them. It's not like they've grown legs and walked away. They're not going anywhere. They're not changing. If anything, the building, the chairs, the door, they're my barometer on how much I've changed as a photographer. After a trip like this, it's pretty hard to see any growth. Guess I'll just have to check again next year.